We're going to start in just 1 minute. So today we have, I don't know if anybody else has kids in the office. It's Bring Your Child to Work Day. And 2 years ago, pre-COVID, we did it for the first time, and a lot of our employees didn't have children, or maybe they were older. So we had Bring Your Dog to Work Day, and now we have lots of kids and lots of dogs. I think we have about 6 or 7 kids and probably 5 dogs. So if you hear anything strange that you don't expect coming from an office, that's the reason why.
Apologies for the Daniel Tiger in the background.
Even as what, a 2-year-old, 3-year-old? David's aggressive about it.
He's my little assistant. He's like, hello? Hello? Not in the mood of webinars.
David was aggressive and brought a toddler. So just a quick background on us. David runs our landlord tenant division, and also does a lot of purchase and sale, resale, condos, co-ops, townhouses. And we have, of course, a resale department. We represent most of the major banks on residential financing, landlord tenant. We also have a big commercial division, whether it's leasing, purchase, sale, or banking. So I guess let's jump into it. It's 11:05. So the market it's interesting, and we look at it pretty granular. I'd say over the last month, well, let's take a back step. Last year during this time, for a 6-month period, we were doing twice as many deals for 6 months straight, just to put things in perspective. It was great, a lot of business, but it was mass chaos. It was frenetic. It was a bit overwhelming, actually. This year, I'd say the last 2 months have been getting more and more active. It's funny, we just, spring break, it's crazy in our city and the suburbs. I think it lasted for about a month. So there was, I'd say about 4 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we had a lot of deals. Last week, it was a little slower. This week is picking up again. So we're finding, though, if you're in the city, everybody knows during COVID, people were getting great deals on rents. And then once the market started picking up, rents almost doubled. So it's incredible. Then you have another factor of rising interest rates, right? So there's a lot of components coming into play now. The rising interest rate environment is kind of brand new the last few weeks. High rents, have been around for a while now. So you have a lot of competing circumstances, right? You're a tenant, your lease expires in 4 to 6 months. You're going to pay 50% more, 75% more. Do you rent again? Do you buy? Now, if you're looking to buy, if you spoke to somebody a year ago about rates and what your buying power, your ability financially was, it may change, or it has changed. If you're getting a mortgage, it may have changed substantially, half a point, 1%. So we want to dig into that and kind of just give some tips and kind of a little, magnifying look into the process. So David, you want to give us a little background on your end?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning, I should say. By the way, as we're going through this and talking, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the chat box, Q&A, raise your hand, whatever. May be happy to make this interactive. So yeah, we're seeing, given all the aspects Andrew just discussed, we're seeing a lot of scenarios right now. A lot of correlation between the rental market and the purchase sale market, specifically as it relates to tenants, existing tenants going out and then ending up purchasing their rental and then becoming owners themselves. Obviously, there's a lot of factors involved. We all know what's going on in the rental market right now. Rents are insane. And another interesting aspect of this is many people moved into these rentals during the COVID season when, of course, rents were very low. Landlords were relatively desperate for tenants, and many tenants were finding great deals on the market. Obviously, that's changed drastically now. So, tenants are finding themselves with the dilemma of either, pay this huge rent increase or, potentially make an offer on a home. And many of these homes, it's far simpler because obviously you're intimately familiar with it. You've been living there. You're comfortable. the building, the home, whatever it may be. So it's a logical step for many of these tenants to take. One important aspect, this relates to any of you out there that are either landlords yourselves or representing landlords. A very hot topic right now is the notice requirement that landlords must give tenants if they are raising the rent by 5% or more, or if they are looking to terminate the lease in its entirety. The notice requirement, of course, is as follows. If the tenant's been in the unit for 1 year or less, it's 30 days. If it's between 1 and 2 years, 60 days. And if they've been in the unit or the home for 2 years or more, you have to give 90 days notice. And again, given all the activity that's going on in the market right now with rent increases, you're seeing landlords across the board raising rent by well over 5%. So it's very important, and if you are a landlord or if you're representing a landlord, to make sure you're abiding by these notice requirements. I literally get phone calls multiple times a day about this from both tenants. You don't want to be faced in a situation where you're trying to raise the rent, but you didn't give the proper notice requirement, tenants pushing back, etc. So you get a little messy. So it's something very, very important to keep in mind. Another interesting aspect of this is how these deals are negotiated. We see a lot of situations where you'll enter into contract with a tenant. They'll continue to pay rent, and then as we get to close, let's say it's a 2-3 month period, all the rent that's paid during that time is then credited towards the purchase price. So that's one way to handle, the rent payments while you're in contract. Another way is to simply waive the rent. We've seen that a lot as well, where landlords enter into contract to sell their house to their tenant, and they'll say, okay, we'll waive rent in the interim, we'll bake it into the purchase price, or whatever it may be. Obviously, you have to be very, very diligent and careful when you are drafting a contract with lease language. Very important. You want to make sure you're fleshing out all the terms of the lease. You want to reference, of course, the rent amount. You want to reference the security deposit amount. That's very important as well. How is the deposit going to be handled? Will the purchaser cut a check at closing? Are you just going to credit it accordingly? There's a lot of different ways to and different tools you can utilize when you are negotiating this contract. So very important. If you're having counsel behind you, you want to make it's falling down. You want to make sure you are. You have a creative attorney who knows exactly how they're going to, sync both the purchase side of the deal and the rental side of the deal as well. So again, very different ways you can adjust the pricing here. See, there's a question here from Mary. I'll read it out loud in case anyone can't see it. When tenants buy, do they still ask for representations by seller on leaks, working appliances, etc.? The sellers do not live there, so they cannot make representations. Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is no, you don't make those representations, right? Because as you mentioned, sellers aren't living there. The tenants are living there, right? So all these items in the contract, obviously basic items like delivering the unit vacant, of course, that's inapplicable. You remove that as well. Leaks, damages, those are all things that the seller will not and cannot represent, right? Because as you indicated, they don't live there. So that's certainly something that we do remove from the contract. Sometimes we'll have tenants require minor touch-ups before entering the contract. That's relatively common and expected. So that's not out of the norm. But yeah, typical representations we definitely won't make. Here's a question from Justin. What are the risks / penalties for the landlord in not giving the proper renewal notice? Very good question. So for example, if the landlord is required to give the 30-day notice and they don't, the increase can only start taking effect once that notice has been delivered and given to the tenant. So, and we see this all the time now, unfortunately, where landlords just don't know about the rule. They think it might be 30 days when they in fact have to give 60 days or vice versa. The increase on the tenant side cannot start until that tenant receives that proper notice. This is a very, very important aspect to keep in mind here. Here's a question. Dave, can you talk a little slower? You're difficult to understand. Yes, I apologize. I will definitely talk a little slower. All right, so continuing on here, one interesting thing also to note from a broker perspective, you see many brokerage agreements on the rental side have language baked in to correspond for sales, for purchase sales. If the unit eventually is sold, they get X amount of commission or whatnot. We do see some very, I guess I would say some savvy brokers also insisting that this language is added to lease riders. I've done a couple of leases where it's a term of the lease that if this unit is sold to the tenant, the brokerage terms are in fact already listed. So that's also something that's very, very important to note. If you are working as a broker, on a rental, and you think there is potential down the road for this renter to purchase the unit. Obviously, it's a good idea to put in regardless, right? Even if you don't think, or there's only a small chance that the tenant will purchase the unit, you still want to have that language. Certainly a good thing to discuss. Andrew, should we talk a little about pre-approvals, timing of that, costs?
Yeah. So I actually anybody who's on social media did a video on this recently about timing. There's no hard and fast rule, but I would say, the general rule of thought, if you're renting and thinking about buying, and especially if you're not buying the unit you're renting in, it's about 6 month leeway. Just kind of working backwards, from accepted offer to contract signing is about 2 weeks. From contract signing to closing for financing deal, a resale, not new development, a co-op or condo financing is about 90 days. So that's 3.5 months. But clearly you need time to, the first step is find a broker, work with a banker on getting a pre-approval, right? That can be a few weeks. I mean, listen, you can find a place in a week, or it can take a few months, right? So figuring out, your budget, figuring out what area of town you want to live in. And I remember just from personal experience, buying, you have to, you have ideas of what you can possibly afford, and it's not always, realistic, or maybe your budget's, higher than you anticipated. So I think initially lining yourself up, I know there are a few brokers on the line here, lining yourself up with a good broker who will typically make some introductions to bankers and attorneys. But at minimum, it's a 3.5 month process if you're financing from when you have an accepted offer, right? So I'd say the general rule of thumb is about 6 months, which sounds a little crazy. You just signed a year lease, and all of a sudden 6 months you have to kind of hit the ground running. But and especially the market right now, it is super active. So you may put offers in on 5 properties and lose out on all the deals, right? So it becomes, a little frustrating. You start running out of time with your lease, and you say, Andrew, what do? I want to buy, but I, haven't found a place yet. I don't have an accepted offer. What should I do? It's not black and white, right? It's not always a square peg in a square hole, which becomes a little frustrating. So, if you lock yourself into another year lease, it's not so easy. David, I'm going to talk about that. We should give everybody reasonable expectations. You can't just cancel a lease, right? You can't just, walk away from a lease, and what are the implications there? And I guess, are there any good tools? If you sign a contract, you just signed a lease, you find a place you love the next day, and you close, and there's still a lot of time left in your lease. Are there any good options?
Yeah, absent really any default or anything on behalf of the landlord, there's really no sort of magic escape clause. You do see many leases where there is an option on behalf of the landlord or the tenant to terminate a lease, but no, the landlord unfortunately would have to consent to it, again, unless there is language baked in that allows you to cancel. One interesting thing I actually came up the other day is that we had a landlord that was using a very outdated lease form. I think it was from 1994. And it actually, these old forms had language saying that if the landlord is looking to sell the unit, he can terminate the lease upon 30 days notice to the tenant. Now, based on what we mentioned earlier, as far as the termination notice requirements to the tenant, that's not the case. You can't just terminate a lease if you're looking to sell. Again, if the lease is expired, if the tenant's a month to month, that's a different story. But you can, if you're 6 months into a 1 year lease with a tenant and then you want to sell the property, you can't just go ahead and terminate the lease. Another important note actually on landlords selling their apartments with existing leases, the lease travels with the unit, right? Not with the owner. So if you're selling it, the lease obviously is assigned to the new owner. Everything carries over. A sale does not impact the terms of the lease. So it's very important to note from both the landlord and tenant perspective that a subsequent sale will not change the lease terms. But again, you do want to make sure that if you're, when you are drafting the lease, you want to use a revised form. There's a lot of ambiguity if you are using an old form that contains outdated terms and laws that don't necessarily apply anymore today. So that's a very important point as well. Anyone have any other questions or items they want to discuss?
So just talking about, I guess, the purchase process in general. Trying to look at the audience. Now we have a few real estate professionals, but just a little kind of getting a little more granular. When you have an accepted offer, right, it's the attorney's job to work on due diligence and contract negotiations. So what's happening during that period? It's usually, hopefully a week, but realistically it's 2 weeks, mostly because we're relying on a third-party managing agent to get us the information we need. Due diligence, we want to review board minutes, financial statements. We actually send our own questionnaire to the managing agent who runs the building. The questionnaire is typically the best piece of due diligence, simply because it gives us the most up-to-date information. We want to, of course, make sure the building is secure financially. Any litigation, is it covered by insurance? Major capital improvements coming down the line, which may affect month-to-month carrying charges. Even day-to-day practical information, leaks, crazy neighbors, noise complaints. So, we're going to make sure that there are no red flags. I always say, no building's perfect. Every building has some sort of issue, but fortunately, most issues are not material, not dramatic. I view my job as an attorney to educate, the consumer, the buyer, right? To give them reasonable expectations, to give them a comfort level as to what's involved. Very, very rarely does a buyer come back and say, we don't want to proceed because we don't like the building. Very rarely are there major red flags because there's, mechanisms in place. There's a co-op and condo board. There's a managing agent to making sure the buildings really don't come off the rails. Every now and then there's litigation that may not be covered by insurance. Is there a huge assessment, and why is there an assessment? And there's the building has upcoming capital improvements and they don't have money to pay for it. Which, listen, that's not the end of the world. That's more of a business decision. Hey, a buyer goes in with their eyes wide open, understanding they may get hit with assessments down the road, or maybe a seller will help pay for them. I'm looking at a question here. So in New York, you have to have an attorney represent you. I don't think I've ever done a deal where one party doesn't have an attorney, and I don't think I would feel comfortable. It wouldn't be worth the risk for me to represent a seller, for example, if a buyer who was not an attorney was representing themselves. So that would, it's just, it's par for the course. And all kidding aside, we have clients, of course, being New York City real estate attorneys that all over the country, all over the world. The process, let's keep it in the USA and, especially California and Florida. The process is dramatically different. Even I live in New Jersey, right? Connecticut, it's much different in New York than other states. For example, in New York, you get an accepted offer, you work on due diligence and the contract, you sign the contract, there's no due diligence period. In other states, you sign the contract first and then have a due diligence period, and the buyer essentially has a way to cancel a deal. In New York, think about it as everything's done, and once you're in contract, 99% of the deals go through. Of course, some business terms, if you negotiate a mortgage contingency and you can't get a loan, which again, 99% of people do get financing. This isn't like we're going to Vegas and, playing roulette. There's a lot more certainty to these deals than people think. The big idea though, for any real estate professional or any real estate client is all about being proactive. You need to think 10 steps ahead, right? You need to have a team that knows what they're doing, because the pace of these deals, especially in the active market, there's no shot of success if you don't have a team that, knows what they're doing, that maintains communication, that's reasonable, that's accessible, that's responsive. For us, the time period between the accepted offer and the contract signing, it's go time. Every day we're pushing forward for the deal to put the client in the best position possible to get the deal done. We have a team, so we're able to, turn around these deals at a high level and quickly. We have somebody that works on due diligence. We're updating the brokers, we're updating the client. It's funny, I always tell clients, we're not going to get you involved in the minutia. I mean, I know how it feels to be a client. You you become very emotional, right? This business is an emotional business. So we tell clients, listen, we'll be in touch once we have some solid, concrete information for you. We're not going to send piecemeal. On the flip side, brokers, we want to keep them updated every day, every other day, especially if we're the buyer's broker, the seller's broker, so they know we're doing everything we can to get that deal into contract. I always say transparency is a good thing. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, transparency is a good thing, right? Let the world know that we got the contract, send back comments the same day. We reach out to the managing agent and they told us, sit tight, we'll be in touch with you in a week, right? So there's a lot of moving parts, and the biggest role, not to sound overwhelming, we always try, and I emphasize to clients, we want to give you a comfort level. You have questions, you have concerns, you call us, and then call us back 15 minutes later. We're not going to rush you off the phone. Certainly, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have questions. I know there's a lot of different ones going on. David, do you see the question from Lori Gross about rent stabilized tenants? Maybe just give a quick little background on that, and if you can answer that question.
Sure, I'm reading it. I'll read it out loud so everyone can hear. If rent stabilized tenant has always put their child on the lease as living there, but the adult child has moved out and has a lease elsewhere, what are the chances that the landlord would have to accept the adult child moving back in under the succession clause, keeping the stabilized tenant? That's a great question. So taking a step back here for a second, the rules regarding succession for rent stabilized apartments are as follows. In order to succeed in that apartment, you have to be a family member, son, daughter, parent, whatever it may be. And you have to have been living there with the named tenant for 2 years or more, right? So in this instance, if the child moved out, they would break that succession clause, but then they would have, if they would move back in and then live with the primary tenant for 2 years or more, then they would reassert their succession rights. An interesting thing here is also you don't have to be listed on the lease to get succession. And I've actually even seen instances where it doesn't even have to be a family member. I've had a lot of cases where it was, for example, a caretaker would be living with an elderly tenant for a couple of years. The tenant would pass, and then that caretaker would assert succession. Of course, everyone knows that in order to maintain a stabilized apartment, it has to be your primary residence. You can't have a home upstate somewhere and then come into the city for a couple of weeks out of the year and stay in your stabilized apartment. It has to be your primary residence. If your landlord is challenging the succession claim, they'll probably look predominantly towards tax returns, bank statements. They want to make sure that everything ties you to the unit. They'll undergo an extensive discovery process. They'll shoot you with a list 3 feet long of requested docs and files to establish that primary residence. These are things that the landlord might challenge. But again, given Laura, just I guess circle back and wrap up your question. Many landlords these days, with the rent law changes that came down in 2019, there's very little incentive for landlords to get rid of stabilized tenants if they're not planning on, renovating that unit or combining it, whatever it may be. You can only raise the rent by roughly $90 a month anyway. So whether or not the landlord goes after it, it's hard to tell. It really depends on what the landlord's motivations are with the unit. But there isn't much incentive these days. However, again, still by the letter of the law, you would still have to be living there for with the tenant for 2 years prior to that tenant leaving. I hope that answered it.
Any other questions? Or any other kind of topics you want us to touch on? But I guess the buying process, if you need connections with bankers or brokers, don't feel overwhelmed. It's definitely a little bit of learning a new language. The process isn't so glamorous, but of course, if you have a good team of professionals, it's our job to facilitate the deal and kind of give reasonable expectations. And there are a lot of moving parts, a lot of parties involved. So just kind of understanding the process is really critical. And the business, it's funny, not to rationalize, it's not set up for perfection. We almost have too many cooks in the kitchen, 2 attorneys, 2 bankers, or I'm sorry, 2 attorneys, 2 brokers, a banker, a bank attorney, a managing agent. But, we always, try to make the deal ceremonious. So we try to make the experience, a pleasant one, an exciting one. But emotions come into play. And some, just like, you take a group of 10 clients, some are nervous, some aren't, and then you have in the middle. So, but I think it's important just to try to enjoy the process and not get overwhelmed, because there's a lot of things you don't control, and there are a few moving parts. But at the end of the day, 99% of these deals do close. So, and then once you close, you kind of forget about all the craziness. But it's an exciting time in our market. And there's certainly opportunity out there, but I think a big thing is, I guess a parting note, you can't generalize when it comes to New York City real estate. Each area is different, location within Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, as far as the market's concerned, whether it's a studio or 2-bedroom, whether it's a co-op or a condo. So, if anybody asks me how the market is, I would respond, well, what part of the market? Where are you with the market? And also I typically rely on a broker, more for comps. But I guess that's really the idea. Stay in touch. I'll put my contact information. David, throw yours in there as well. If anybody is into social media, you can follow the firm, you can follow myself. I try to post a lot with little just kind of tools, and just kind of tips, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. So it's a great way just to kind of stay fresh. On our website, we have a ton of webinars, YouTube. So there's a lot of content out there for you if you're trying to learn. Yeah, so anonymous attendee, yes. Social media, YouTube, our website, there's tons of information out there. Well, have a great day. We're going to get some lunch for the kids soon, and stay in touch. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.